There we go. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to Hawkins again. Before we get started, I just got news that we're getting a message from the Upside Down. So if everyone can kind of be really attentive for just the next 30 seconds to a minute, they move quick and fast and furious in the Upside Down. You know how quickly Vecna and his little gang can follow and get track of us. So in the next slide here, you're going to see we set up one of those Christmas light walls. So get ready, whether you just have a phone or a piece of paper, we're getting a message from the Upside Down. So if one of my D&D colleagues could just switch the screen, we'll get started. Oh, it is moving very quickly. Maybe we should let them see if they can get to us twice here. They're saying it again. Okay, it's giving us a second chance here. If you know what it is, feel free to drop it in the chat. I think it's a pretty important message before we get started. Seems like we're having a transmission issue from the Upside Down. We'll give you a hint because they did give us a clue before this started. It starts with the letter I. There it is. We got someone that got it. Absolutely. IHL saves lives. And we think that's pretty rad that even from the Upside Down, our friends know that these laws are very, very important. So thank you for helping us decode that message before we get started here. I just want to welcome everyone to Hawkins again. We're so happy to be able to celebrate Halloween with you and enjoy all things Stranger Things and IHL today. My name is Larissa Hatch, but Dustin and his friends know me as Counselor Hatch from Camp Nowhere. When I'm not putting out fires at Science Camp, you can find me leading the IHL Youth Action Campaign program, where we have American Red Cross students and other partners alike teach their peers about the value of IHL. The D&D crew today asked me to host our event because we're a neutral body. We're not from Hawkins. We're just here today to be the camp community that is focusing on neutrality, just like the American Red Cross. So before we get started, just a few rules that I wanted to bring from camp to all of you today. We're going to have some gifts and movement. So for our photosensitive viewers, just be a little mindful of our slides. We will be recording this event, and we also have an encore presentation on Wednesday night. So for anyone who can't join, we'll be sure to drop our YouTube link to this pop culture event and all of the series that we have in the chat. If one of my colleagues can drop that in the chat. And I think some of you have found it, but we have a great active chat going. Please continue to use that. Feel free to use the reactions, the clapping, the hearts, the cheering our in-house experts on. It's a great way to stay engaged in the conversation. But of course, we ask you all to be very respectful. We all have a lot of love and opinions of these beloved characters. So let's just try to keep the conversation kind and aware. We're all here to learn together, but enjoy a little levity in this really intense topic that is IHL. So while we are going through this, again, feel free to use the chat, but we also have a Q&A feature. So we're going to have a quick Q&A section at the end of our presentation. Feel free to drop those in as we go, and we will get to as many as we can by the end of our presentation. And if not, we'll drop our contact information so you can always ask questions past that. And I think the last thing I just want to share is that if you are interested in this, stick around till the end because we want to make sure to engage you in our larger IHL and Youth Action Campaign community. But before we get started, IHL, as we know, is a very important topic. It's all around us, but what really is it? We want to make sure we find relevance in these principles in what we're seeing in current events or armed conflicts, but it's pretty neat that we're able to identify using these principles in mediums like the Stranger Things series. It helps us see the value in upholding these laws and helps all of us be a little bit more in tune and active citizens in our own communities when it comes to protecting human lives and human dignity. So before we dive in, I'm going to pass things over to Thomas, our fearless leader, to give us a nice definition to start with for the rest of our presentation. Thanks, Thomas.
Welcome to the Hellfire Club. I want to thank Counselor Hatch for giving this space here at Camp Nowhere to play a little Dungeons and Dragons and to really expand our minds with this game. We are inviting each and every one of you who has come here today and taken time out of your valuable schedules to be part of our D&D crew. So pick your class, we'll get you leveled up, and by the end of this this one-shot campaign here, you're going to have increased your experience points in the IHL realm. You're going to know more than you did when you started, and we're going to be glad to have you on our crew anytime you wish to join. So with that, I'm Thomas Harper. I'm a dark elf level 16, so don't test me there on the D&D battlefield. But I'm also the senior legal advisor for the American Red Cross IHL program, and it's my privilege to lead a really talented team of my fellow D&Ders here today as we walk you through a campaign of IHL tied to one of our favorite shows, Stranger Things. But I would be remiss if I didn't start with a large high-level view of what IHL is. Pop culture is so great at understanding and helping put a better set of glasses on these real-world complex issues, because it connects us with these complicated topics using something that we're all familiar with. For the last 4 seasons of Stranger Things, we've grown up with the crew with Dustin and Elle and Hopper and everybody in that Hawkins Stranger Things universe. And what better way to help frame some real world issues and help better understand things that are unfolding in our world? So with that, we ask, what is international humanitarian law anyhow? In a nutshell, it's a set of rules, as you see there, that seeks to rein in armed conflict. It is a body of treaty law, a body of customary law, a really complex web of legal topics that really operate to try to limit as much as possible the destructive effects of armed conflict. IHL doesn't operate to stop armed conflict. It's in fact a nice a balancing scale that on one side recognizes that armed conflict may be inevitable, that stopping armed conflict may be a goal, but one that may not be practical. But so long as armed conflict exists, we as a human race can impart some basic rules by which to fight that'll rein in that unchecked destruction that is all too often characteristic of armed conflict. So in a nutshell, when you think of armed conflict, it's synonymous with the law of armed conflict. When you think of IHL, it's synonymous with the law of armed conflict. It's synonymous with the law of war. It's the same body of law that we're talking about that the military uses in armed conflict, and that humanitarians and others work around in trying to limit those destructive effects. So I know what you're thinking. War is chaotic. Why are we bothering to try to put rules? Why are we bothering to try to apply these to a TV show that isn't about a war? And you may be sitting here with a Steve face on right now. And that's okay. That's okay. By the end of this, you're going to realize the real critical importance of IHL. Its importance to those who are innocent on the battlefield, civilians, folks who are out of combat, those who are injured, those who have been captured. And you're going to reach that understanding really quickly by using Stranger Things. Not everyone on this call may be a legal expert with a degree and training in this area or experience, and that's okay. That's the beauty of it, because we all are familiar with Stranger Things. We're familiar with these characters. Some of you may have hated Steve at first and now love him and would defend him with your very lives. And it's really easy to take those characters and those familiar scenes and apply some of these lessons. Think of this like putting a pair of glasses on to better see some of these real world issues. And that's the beauty of what we're going to do here today. And we're going to start with my colleague, our level 15 barbarian, Vanita Banthia. Vanita, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me, Thomas?
Perfectly.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanita Banthia, but today I am talking about an aspect of international humanitarian law. Thomas did a great job of presenting an overview, and I'm going to be talking about conflict classification. So within international humanitarian law, to determine whether an armed conflict, whether IHL or international humanitarian law applies, you need to determine whether or not there is an armed conflict. And there are two types of armed conflict. It's either it's international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict, abbreviated as IAC or NIAC, NIAC or IAC. And different sets of rules apply depending on whether you have an IAC or an NIAC. So it's really important to classify and put the conflict into context before we can determine whether IHL applies, and if it does, what sets of rules need to be followed. So starting with international armed conflict. An international armed conflict is essentially a conflict occurring between two or more states. And it really depends on who is authorized within the states to represent the state and to give consent, consent being sort of the key concept here. So if a state intervenes in the territory of another state with the state's consent, so the state that is receiving, say, help or assistance from an outside state consents to that other state's presence in the conflict, then there would be no international armed conflict because the external state is working in tandem with the housing state. But without such consent, there is an international armed conflict. So, for example, in Yemen, the situation where Saudi Arabia is involved, but its involvement is with the consent of the Yemen government. And so that's an example where even though there are two states involved, we don't see an international armed conflict. But if there was no consent from the government, then you would have an international armed conflict. So to be valid, consent needs to be given by a person or entity with the authority to speak on behalf of the state, such as the heads of state, the government, or the highest authority in the state. Examples of IACs are the world wars or the current war between Russia and Ukraine. A non-international armed conflict, on the other hand, is a conflict or a situation of violence involving protracted armed confrontations between government forces and one or more organized armed groups, or between two armed groups themselves arising in the territory of a state. Now, this has more distinct criteria, and IHL requires that two criteria be specifically met in order for a conflict to be classified as a non-international armed conflict. The first requirement is the existence of an organized an organized group, and there must be a minimum degree of organization. And this is, and then the second, sorry, I'm going to make you go back to the last slide quickly, Thomas. The second criteria is that the armed confrontation must reach a minimum level of intensity. And both of these have specific factors, sub-factors, if you will, to determine whether each of these criteria are met. So in examining whether the degree of organization is met, some of the factors that are considered are whether there's a chain of command, whether there is the ability to transmit and enforce orders, and whether there is a coordinated mechanism to plan and launch operations. And likewise, in determining whether a minimum level of intensity is met, there must be protracted violence in the sense that a certain threshold of armed violence has to be reached. And indicators of this is the number of fighters involved, the gravity of armed clashes, the types of government forces involved, the number of fighters involved, and then the extent of the damage and the number of casualties, as well as the types of weapons and the sophistication involved. So it's really important to note that isolated disturbances or tensions, such as riots or sporadic acts of violence, don't necessarily classify as a non-international armed conflict and don't have the IHL rules applying to them. So it's an important distinction to make. And then returning to some of the definitions, under the Geneva Conventions, and their, the also worth noting here is that IHL really encompasses and grants a much larger body of protections to international armed conflicts. So the full length of treaties and customary law applies, and there's a lot more protections for victims and civilians under international armed conflict as opposed to non-international armed conflicts. So moving on to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols is a body of public international law that's also referred to as humanitarian law of armed conflicts. And the purpose of this body of law is to provide a minimum level of protections and standards of treatment and fundamental guarantees of respect to individuals who become victims of armed conflict. So all four Geneva Conventions of 1949 apply to international armed conflict. Article 2, common to the Geneva Conventions, defines international armed conflicts as all cases of declared war or of any other armed conflict, whether or not it's been officially declared, that arises between two or more of the high contracting parties. And high contracting parties really refers to what I was talking about earlier, governments, bodies that have the authority within the state to grant consent. The rules governing non-international armed conflicts are provided for in Common Article 3 to the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, and Additional Protocol 2 of 1977 of the Geneva Conventions also defines provides an official definition to NIACs. So moving to our Stranger Things analysis of international law, international humanitarian law, we want to start by examining the key parties and different players at issue. So in Stranger Things, we have the Hawkins crew, which is Elle and her friends, the main characters of the show. We also have the Upside Down, which is controlled by Vecna, and we learn in season 4 that he really controlled Vecna, who happens to be Henry Creel, is also very much in control of all different aspects of the Upside Down. And then we also have the US government, which constitutes the US Department of Energy, different government agents, as well as Hawkins Lab. And finally, we have the Soviet forces, which are in season 4, mostly operating outside of the country, but in season 3 are operating within Starcourt Mall. And those are the main players. Within the analysis, when we talk about international armed conflict, there may be a possibility in 3rd season that we could have an international armed conflict because there is a level of violence and involvement in the US with the Soviet forces operating at Starcourt Mall. But in the 4th season, there isn't really direct conflict or violence or armed conflict shown between the governments of the US and the Soviet forces. So there is most likely not an international armed conflict in the 4th season. And moving on to the analysis of the possibility of a non-international armed conflict, we see that there is a lot of violence and a very high intensity of violence within the US that's occurring. And so we have to examine the 2 different factors. And the first of those factors is the level of intensity of the violence. And in many occasions, we see the destruction and the power that Vecna has, and the amount of destruction that he's able to impart on Hawkins, as well as through his powers on different individuals. There's a large number of casualties, and then we also see that the second factor is organization. And because we learned that so much of the Upside Down is controlled by one person, which is Vecna, and we learned that he has control of the Mind Flayer, he is able to control he has almost full control of the Upside Down. And so if the Upside Down is seen as sort of an insurgent group or an opposition force within the US, we have a high level of violence imparted by Vecna and the Upside Down against the US government and the US and Hawkins, the city as a whole, and a high level of casualty within Hawkins. So the organization factor, I would say there's a high likelihood that both of those factors would be met. And to do a quick analysis of the 3rd group here, which is Elle and her friends, and the people that help her, while they are working with a similar goal as the US government to destroy Vecna and to destroy the Upside Down, they're not really working in tandem with the US government, and so they would be considered a second group. And while they wouldn't meet the level of intensity of violence that they have imparted in the US or in Hawkins, but we do see that, but we already have that criteria met with the Upside Down and Vecna. So we're already in, those 2 players already create enough of, already fulfill the factors that are required for a non-international armed conflict. So while we don't have an international armed conflict, it is a strong likelihood that the fighting between Vecna and the Upside Down, between the US government, would classify as a non-international armed conflict. Thank you. I will now pass it on to our science correspondent, Miranda Surratt, reporting out of Hawkins Lab.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again, Vanita. My name is Miranda Surratt, I am a freshman at Salisbury University, currently studying medical lab sciences. And today for our Stranger Things event, I am the representative of the Hawkins Laboratory. And today I want to discuss some of the International Humanitarian Law rules for biological, medical, and scientific experiments. So the picture on the next slide is of German Nazi doctor and war criminal Joseph Mengele. Some of you on this call today might know of him and his history. He is responsible for one of the most horrific examples of medical and scientific experiments conducted on children during times of war. He conducted a set of experiments called the Mengele twin experiments. These experiments earned him the nickname the Angel of Death, and the twins in his experiment were subjected to a wide variety of experiments. Under Article 32 of the Geneva Convention number 4, mutilation and medical or scientific experiments not necessitated by the medical treatment of a protected person are prohibited. According to Article 147, conducting biological experiments on protected persons is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. Additional Protocol 1 is a 1977 amendment to the Geneva Conventions, which talks about the protection of victims in international conflicts, where armed conflicts in which peoples are fighting against colonial domination, alien occupation, or racist regimes are considered to be international conflicts. It affirms the laws of the original Geneva Convention and adds clarifications to accommodate developments that have taken place since the Second World War. One of the articles within Additional Protocol 1 deals with the topic of experimentation on people involved in armed conflicts. Article 11 deals with the protection of persons. I will be talking through one specific piece of Article 11, which states that it is prohibited to carry out on such persons, even with their consent, physical mutilations, medical or scientific experiments, and removal of tissue or organs for transplantation. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is a multilateral treaty that commits states parties to respect civil and political rights such as right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, rights to due process, and a fair trial. This was adopted by the United Nations on December 16th of 1966. It is important to discuss this treaty in the context of experimentation because it includes a section that discusses medical and scientific experiments. Article 7 states that no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. The International Criminal Court investigates and, where warranted, tries individuals charged with the gravest crimes of concern to the international community, such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. The court aims to hold those responsible accountable for their crimes and to help prevent these crimes from happening. The ICC is governed by an international treaty called the Rome Statute, which was established on July 17, 1998. The Rome Statute lays out what constitutes a war crime when it involves medical and scientific experiments. In both international and non-international armed conflicts, the following is a war crime: subjecting persons who are in the power of adverse parties to physical mutilation, medical or scientific experiments of any kind, which are neither justified by the medical, dental, or hospital treatment of the person concerned, nor carried out in his or her interest, and which cause death or seriously endanger the health of such persons. So I now want to transition from the historical stuff into talking about how we see this play out in Stranger Things. At the beginning of season 1, we are introduced to Dr. Brenner, the Hawkins lab, and 11. The Hawkins lab is shown to be a secretive place in the middle of the woods, surrounded by a fence. We see on the inside that it is full of rooms that are housing children and the different experiments that they are being subjected to. The experiments conducted by Dr. Brenner and the Hawkins laboratory staff are based on a real set of experiments nicknamed Project MK Ultra, which was a covert CIA program started in the early 1950s. It expanded its research to include everything from mind control to telepathy, psychic warfare, and remote viewing. As we see in Stranger Things flashback scenes with Elle submerged in a sensory deprivation tank, it was the belief that it is possible to use the power of your mind to see events happening thousands of miles away. This was most notably done by utilizing LSD in the hope that it would become the ultimate truth serum capable of breaking down any enemy agents. We're going to look specifically at experiments that Elle is subjected to in Stranger Things Season 1. In Season 1, we are introduced to Eleven and her backstory behind how she got to the lab. In one of the flashbacks, we see that her mom took part in the experiments conducted by Dr. Brenner, which were built to resemble Project MK Ultra. As a result of all of the experiments, Elle was born with extraordinary psychokinetic abilities, such as the ability to perform telepathy and telekinesis. Growing up in the lab, we see that she was forced to live with her name being 011. This number only further highlights the fact that she is a test subject in Brenner's experiments. Brenner built himself an image with all the children by acting like a father figure and referring to himself as Papa. One of the important things that we see when we are first introduced to Elle and the experiments in Season 1 is that while she is at the lab, she's allowed to play in what is called the Rainbow Room with the other children. Through tests, scientists wish to discover and enhance the extent of her psychic abilities. One experiment we see in Season 1 involves Eleven crushing a Coke can, as seen on the slide. Another experiment was to test Elle's ability in various ways until we get to the point where she is supposed to contact the Demogorgon. After she proceeds to contact the creature, we eventually witness her escape from the lab. I want to fast forward and now look at the experiments that took place in Season 4 before I point out distinctions between the two seasons and how they relate to IHL and Rules of War. In Season 4, we are introduced to a new set of experiments that Elle is a part of. We see that Elle hears about the events going on at Hawkins with Vecna and all of the deaths. She willingly chooses to go to a secret facility with Dr. Owens and Dr. Brenner to try to regain her powers. While the show likes to remind us that it is her choice to go through these experiments, it is important to remember that she is just a child who has spent her time without abilities. She trusts Dr. Owens and is willing to do anything to feel in control again. When he comes to her with the promises of returning her powers and helping Hawkins, how could Elle refuse? Owens knows this and uses this to his advantage to get her to come back willingly. Elle is manipulated into believing that she is in control when she has no say in her fate. She is thrown into this experiment by Dr. Brenner and Owens without context or preparation for what she's about to face. Now there are some important distinctions that need to be made as it relates to IHL. For starters, let's state the obvious. Eleven is by definition a child in Season 1 and Season 4. While these experiments we see in Stranger Things are considered voluntary experiments, Elle is by definition a minor. Therefore, she should not be forced to make a decision about whether or not to participate in the experiments because she is not signing a consent form that most of us sign when we participate in studies or experiments. The experiments that she is a part of in Season 1, however, do not violate IHL because of the events that occur. The upside down does not exist during Season 1. However, the experimentation that she is subjected to does violate plenty of US domestic laws, but there is no armed conflict happening that would trigger violations of IHL. The experiments that she is a part of in Season 4, however, do violate international humanitarian law because of the events that occur. The upside down and all of the characters, such as Vecna, do exist. Due to the fact that there is a defined armed conflict occurring during Season 4 that involves the upside down and the real world, the experiments Elle is subjected to would implicate and trigger violations of IHL. International humanitarian law is only implicated when there is a defined armed conflict occurring, and therefore any experimentation that people are subjected to during that conflict would be a violation. However, if there is no defined armed conflict occurring, then IHL cannot be implicated and any experiments happening would not be considered a violation. Unfortunately, I must get back to my work at the Hawkins lab, so I will now pass it over to my colleague Lily at the Starcourt Mall.
Thank you, Miranda. Hi, everyone. My name's Lily, and I'm a sophomore at East Chapel Hill High School, and I'm an IHL advocate from the Eastern North Carolina region. Today, I'm going to take everyone back into Season 3 to the Starcourt Mall underneath the secret Sylvan laboratory and the experiment under invention, the key. Recap to some detail in Season 3. Starting off with their life. Jonathan, Will, and Josie have a fresh start since the conflict last year. Elle's living with Hopper in their house inside the forest. Mike and Elle relationship got more serious since they had their first fight and flipped. Max, on the other hand, took Elle to the Starcourt Mall to have some girls' fun. It seems like everything is going normal and peaceful, but danger gradually, little by little, comes from the underground. As we dig underground, deeper under the Starcourt Mall, into the dark and mysterious laboratory, into the project that the Sylvans are doing, we can see this huge, frightening, and powerful machinery called the keys. It's already built and had been used to open the gates connected to the Upside Down that Elle has previously closed. However, the secret and dangerous machine is built under the mall where citizens and people are crowded. We discovered that the Sylvans are using the key not just to open a portal to the Upside Down, but to bring back a familiar enemy, the terrorizing Demogorgon. The Sylvans have a monster-sized cage in the secret lab, which means they know exactly what they are after. The most recent season confirms the Sylvans' goal in bringing back the monster and preparing an army of them to unleash. Use of the Demogorgon as a weapon of war will violate two of the fundamental principles of IHL, distinction and reducing unnecessary suffering. Distinction requires that fighters distinguish between military and civilian targets. The Demogorgon is a killing machine, which can tell the difference between people. It sees you, it attacks to kill, period. Using such an indiscriminate weapon on the battlefield will be prohibited under IHL. The principle of unnecessary suffering means that you cannot use weapons designed to cause needless suffering or superfluous wounds. The Demogorgon is a killing machine similarly designed to terrorize victims. From its frightful appearance to its blood-curdling howl, releasing this kind of monster on the battlefield will plainly violate the principle of unnecessary suffering. Those weapons are not just one of the Sylvans' inventions. Let's move back onto the ground, into the Starcourt Mall, and to the ice cream shop where Steve and Robin work at. The Sylvans in Season 3 also created cancer of radioactive green substance, which were used to power the key. The Sylvans secretly delivered the cancer of chemical to their secret base beneath Starcourt Mall in the pretense of making deliveries to shoe shops and fast food restaurants. The Scoop Troop consists of Dustin, Steve, Robin, and Erica, discovered the Sylvans in Hawkins. They managed to get into the secret elevator room and find a cancer of radioactive green substance, and eventually they arrived at the heart of the operation, the main laboratory, and saw the whole machinery spitting out rays to crack the Upside Down open. However, later Steve and Robin were captured by the Sylvan soldiers, taken to a room and interrogated. Steve gets really battered and bruised. The commander demands him to tell all the truth and how he found out the laboratory. But when Steve doesn't provide specific answers, the commander ties him and Robin together. Then a doctor comes in, strapping them into chairs and injecting them with some kind of truth serum. After they wake up in days, the doctor threatens them to pull out of their fingernails until Robin blurts out more of the truth. The truth serum connects to humanity treatment. According to POW ICRC Control of Drugs and Human Prisoner Treatments, Convention 3, relative to the treatment of prisoner of war, it states that first, prisoner of war must at all times be humanly treated. Second, Likewise, prisoners of war must at all times be protected, particularly against acts of violence or intimidation and against insults and public curiosity. 3. Measures of reprisal against prisoners of war are prohibited. Fortunately, after being injected with serum and suffering from being beaten by the Soviet soldiers, the scoop troop escaped the basement safely, but it isn't the end. The mine flyer was able to escape the gates into the Stockholm Mall and start to attack the group. Elle is able to use her power to restrict the mine flyer, and the others are working together to throw firework sticks at the mine flyer. The mall was almost entirely destroyed. Billy, who was possessed by the upside-down monster, was brought back by Elle from sharing a vision of his happy childhood memory. His humanity urged him to decide to sacrifice himself in exchange for everyone else's safety. Unfortunately, Elle lost all her power when the mind flare bit her and left a piece of herself inside of her. Although the mind flare eventually falls down, the group also loses very heavily. And at the end of season 3, the Demogorgon is still alive. Taking back to Russia, we can see from the season 3 post-credit scene, we are taken to a mystery space in Russia, where you can view how Soviet soldiers are feeding the prisoners to a Demogorgon. It is terrorizing, and the way they subjected to treat the prisoner also violated this unlimited suffering IHL principle. And now I will pass it off to Thomas.
I want to thank my 3 very talented party members. Nothing but natural 20s were rolled during their presentations. So I bring you to the end, and we're going to start by talking about season 4 of Stranger Things from just this year. So it hopefully is fresh on your mind. We're going to talk specifically about none other than Vecna's Curse, everybody's favorite bad dream with a great soundtrack to it. Now, Vecna, if you're not familiar, is this just really, really nice looking gentleman. That's a face that only a hellspawn could love. And, he's really excited this time of year. Pumpkin spice lattes are back. He's actually in a good mood for once. And he's come up with a really, really good idea. He is very, very excited this Halloween because he has a new game show that he wants to debut in Hawkins. So we're going to meet our contestants. We have Fred Benson. Fred has been nominated for most likely to look exactly like I did in high school. We have the sweetheart of Hawkins High herself, Chrissy Cunningham. We have Patrick McKinney, who's a star football player and doesn't put up with any Dungeons and Dragons shenanigans whatsoever. And we have the girl who was in on the Kate Bush, before any of us jumped on the bandwagon, Max Mayfeld. So no good game show would be without some prizes. So let's see what can be won with Vecna's Curse, this great new game show. Well, first you can get some horrendous migraines that are untreatable. You can also get a nice all expense paid trip to some past traumas. Vecna's Curse is also going to give you some really superb and frightening hallucinations. I will never look at a grandfather clock at all the same again. And you're going to get to meet the VIP himself, Vecna, in a very intimate setting. He's also going to throw in some private levitation sessions to wow all of your friends. And also you might die at the end. And by May, I mean, you definitely will die at the end of Vecna's Curse. Henry Vecna doesn't understand the complaints here. I don't know why any of these folks are complaining. Why is Max playing music to drown out this great game show? Who wants to listen to Kate Bush when you could levitate? He doesn't understand what the problem with all this is. Well, the issue is that Vecna's Curse exists not in a vacuum, but in the context of an armed conflict. He is the leader, as Vanita so artfully laid out for you, of the Upside Down. We find out in season 4 that Vecna isn't just another big bad in this shadow realm. He is the big bad. He controls the Mind Flayer, the creature that we were all led to believe was the king of all bad guys in the Upside Down. He controls the Demobats that Eddie so artfully plays off with Metallica. He is in charge of everything, and he has waged open war in season 4, is attempting to wage open war against the real world, against Hawkins, against the U.S. government, against the Hawkins crew. Any human being that is on the surface, he's coming for. He doesn't care. And so that puts his actions, this curse that he puts upon people, into specific context. So let's call back to Vanita's portion and think about what she said regarding non-international armed conflicts. We're going to accept that Vanita's analysis was correct, because it is. And so the sandbox that we're playing in are the Geneva Conventions, Common Article 3, and Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Conventions. She walked you through that. That's the sandbox. That's the set of rules on the back of the game box that we're playing with. Unfortunately, a NIAC doesn't engage the entire scope of IHL. It's a more narrow scope because of how NIACs are treated. But there are some important rules in play that are very, very relevant to Vecna's curse. Let's look at those. Let's first turn to Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. Think of Common Article 3 as a nice, solid safety net under all of IHL. It provides a set of enduring protections, no matter what type of conflict you're in, if IHL is triggered. And chief among those protections is the complete and outright prohibition against torture. There's no gray area there within Common Article 3. It is prohibited outright. Now, you move into AP2 and you see a similar prohibition. It is also outright prohibited under any circumstances. You don't get to be Jack Bauer to cross our streams into another pop culture realm and also date myself. That was a very good TV show in the early 2000s. But there are no circumstances that justify torture. There just aren't. That provision in AP2 is also found under a section that's known as fundamental guarantees. So torture just isn't prohibited under AP2. It is crowned as one of the fundamental guarantees that folks who are imprisoned during armed conflict have, even if it's not an international armed conflict. So the drafters of Geneva, the drafters of AP2 really felt strongly about the need to outlaw completely, without exception, torture. That begs the question. That's why you've got a lawyer talking to you. What is torture? How do you define it? I think all the lawyer jokes stem back from us and our penchant for questioning the definition of every single word. But torture is the operative word in these rules. What do we mean by torture? What is IHL trying to get at when it uses that term? Well, let's look to the Rome Statute. My colleague Miranda pointed out the Rome Statute and its architecture really well. The Rome Statute has a nice definition that's a good baseline for it. And you see it on the screen there. The intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, upon a person in the custody or under the control of the accused. Well, let's look at that a little more closely. In the custody or under the control of the accused, right? I don't know how you would torture somebody that's completely not under your custody or control, but there's that important linkage there. Well, what about Vecna's contestants? I mean, victims. What about Fred and Chrissy and Max? Well, as season 4 makes plainly clear, they don't have any choice in this. These 4 young high school students are caught in this mental web of Vecna's. You see Max there. The only way that she can sort of escape, albeit temporarily, Vecna's curse is to put on Kate Bush running up that hill and keep it on repeat. So it keeps her in sort of a safe space. But once Vecna gets past sort of that temporary barrier, we see exactly what happens to the students when they're under Vecna's curse. They're completely sort of mentally trapped. Max is transported to the Upside Down, where she is absolutely terrorized. She cannot get free of it. The grandfather clock plays that really critical role of sort of ticking down each of these students' time left on Earth before Vecna sort of escalates it full ways. Now, when we talk about torture, the sort of knee jerk is to be really familiar with physical torture, right? Lily had the great example from season 3 of the poor folks, the poor members of the Scoop Troop. They're in the basement of Starcourt. They get caught by the Soviet forces. Poor Steve takes an absolute beating, and only to disclose the absolute truth that he works at the mall ice cream shop. Very valuable classified information for the Soviets. That's the kind of torture that oftentimes gets popularized in movie and TV shows, this sort of like classic beating type thing. That's absolutely outlawed. But let's look back at that rule. Look a little closer, and you see that what the statute doesn't, or the definition of torture doesn't just include physical torture. It also includes mental torture. The drafters of Geneva and sort of the framers that were aiming to outlaw torture recognized that you can absolutely inflict severe suffering on somebody mentally. Think about the person that's captured and they're presented with supposed true information that their family has been killed. If the person torturing them knows that that's not true and is using it to inflict anguish upon them, using it for whatever purpose, to inflict suffering, that's torture just the same as a punch or a slap or anything physical. And think about what Vecna does with the curse. He doesn't just immediately go and lead these children to their untimely demise. He mentally tortures them. He presents Fred with this recurring awful revisitation of this trauma, this car crash that he was apparently involved in and was the only survivor. You see this sort of brutal scene of him escaping the wreck, and a friend of his is caught trapped in the accident. And even poor Max is tortured with the thought of her stepbrother Billy, who was just a really class A bad guy, but ultimately sort of came around right as he died, sort of made that sacrifice for her. Vecna uses these past traumas as a hook. He uses that as the sort of crack in the mental door that he then kicks in and takes control of these students. And there's a purpose behind it. Now torture and the definition under IHL doesn't require you to have any sort of purpose behind it. Torture is torture, regardless of your motives there. But Vecna has a pretty twisted motive. He is using this mental torture in order to break these young folks and then steal their life force so that he can open portals into the real world, from the Upside Down into the real world. His ultimate plan, once he secures Max, who is the last puzzle piece, the last bit of life energy, if you will, that he needs, is to sort of permanently open up these multiple fronts into Hawkins and in the United States, into the real world, and cause absolute destruction. He shows a vision of exactly what he has planned, and you see it here. It's the total annihilation of the world as we know it, complete and utter chaos, and it's all done through mental torture. So I don't know that sort of impassioned layout of the law there is going to have any impact on Henry or any impact on Vecna. In fact, I think Vecna would just swap Max out and bring me back to the day that I had to return of the Jedi, that my rental from Blockbuster was out and I couldn't watch it another time. He'd do that, and then I would be a tool of his. But it is critical in the real world, because time and again studies have shown, and this is the results of an ICRC study that was done just a few years ago, or a poll, that individuals across the globe, and particularly here in the United States, believe that under certain circumstances, torture is okay, that torture is lawful. And you see here on that chart there, a not insignificant percentage of the American population believes that. And the numbers, that total has unfortunately ticked up over the past decade or so, meaning more and more Americans are believing that torture might be okay in some circumstances. Well, I'm here to tell you, and I'm here to break the bad news to Vecna and Henry Creel, that torture is never allowed, never, ever allowed during armed conflict, period. Exigency doesn't matter, the danger of a particular circumstance or the knowledge that that prisoner might have. None of those things matter because torture is unlawful, period. And if you remember nothing else from this presentation, I hope that you would take that forward with you and know that with absolute certainty. So we're going to pause here for questions. And I just want to put out a call for a round of applause for our other three presenters. Myself is not included in that. Vanita is a volunteer of ours, an IHL dissemination volunteer out of Philadelphia. And you saw the extraordinary talent that she brought to the table alongside both Lily and Miranda, both of whom are youth action campaign advocates. Miranda is just in her freshman year of college, and Lily is a high schooler. To perform like this on this sort of stage, to impart this sort of knowledge and be under this sort of spotlight is really, really tremendous. And I know that they did an outstanding job, and I'm just glad that all of you came to see this. So Counselor Hatch, if you have some questions loaded up, we would be glad to answer that. And hopefully I don't roll a one and get a critical failure on any of these things.
Actually, I do not see any questions. If anyone has any, feel free to drop them in the Q&A portion of at the bottom of your screen. But I did see a little conversation around mental torture. So after you showed the slide about torture never being allowable under IHL, can you dig a little bit more into mental torture?
Yeah, so mental torture, it's not precisely defined, but it's the idea of causing mental anguish, right? Telling your prisoner or doing something to your prisoner that puts them in mental anguish. Waterboarding, which has a really unfortunate and sort of dark history as an interrogation tactic, is a good example of this. That's a physical method of doing something to someone. You're sort of depriving them of certain senses and then pouring water over them, but it simulates a drowning effect. And you're not actually drowning. No water is going in your mouth to the point, well, if under certain circumstances to actually kill you, but it creates that absolute panic and that absolute terror. That's a classic black and white example of mental torture. Regardless of how that's been interpreted, that squarely fits that definition.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I think seeing all those claps, it's definitely like we rally and agree. Torture is never allowable under any circumstances. So appreciate that. I think we might have one more question. Who decides what meets the standard for organized entity to determine that humanitarian law applies for a NIAC? Seems like it could be interpreted differently. It's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. There's no IHL is an excellent, really critical body of law, but it relies on the all too often on the parties involved to make that recognition. So you see time and time again where entities will get into an armed conflict and it be decided. I don't know that in, say, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, that the two sides sat down and decided that this would be declared as an international armed conflict, but they've treated it that way. And so oftentimes the parties will act according to the proper classification and do that. A great example in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the existence of POWs. That's a status for detained folks that doesn't exist in a NIAC. You could still be detained, but POW as a status doesn't exist. They're prisoners of war, according to both sides. They're both respecting that sort of designation, and so all too often it's sort of up to the parties that are on the ground. There's not an international enforcement mechanism to that. I would submit to you that post-conflict, if the judgment was made that it was one conflict or another and certain rules should have been in play, that may influence investigations in post-conflict judgment and the evaluation of certain conduct within the hostilities.
Thanks, Thomas. I think to be mindful of everyone's time, any other questions can definitely be sent to either ihlaw@redcross.org or ihlyouth@redcross.org. These are our two programs under the International Humanitarian Law umbrella. IHL dissemination is an adult dissemination program where if you are interested, I see some names that we definitely have some instructors in the room. You can become a trained instructor and educate others on IHL. And like Lily and Miranda, if you have students that are interested in this, schools, Red Cross clubs, feel free to reach out to us at ihlyouth@redcross.org. We'd love to get you involved and start a club or start an IHL advocate team, Youth Action Campaign advocate team, where our young people are out there educating their peers and their communities, just like Lily, Miranda, and all of the advocates that you might have met along the way. Along with that, on the screen here, you can see just some of our pop culture events we've had in the past. One of my colleagues will drop the link in the chat we have a YouTube page where all of these are published. So you're welcome to revisit any of these at any time. Besides that, before we get to this one, Thomas, I do want to drop in the chat, we are going to have an encore presentation of this. So to be mindful of time zones, we're going to try something new and have an encore presentation on Wednesday, November 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern to try to get some more folks in the room. I'm dropping the link in the chat. It's a separate registration link from this one. So be sure to share that out widely if you want to either revisit this or share it with folks who haven't been able to join us today. And as always, this one will be recorded and dropped on the YouTube link. I'm gonna pass it over to Thomas to talk about this upcoming event we have also this week. And I'll drop the YouTube link in the chat.
Thanks, Counselor Hatch. Our D&D group is getting right back together on November 3rd. The Hellfire Club will be back in action with a new dungeon master in our legal extern, Hunter Burke from the University of Texas School of Law, who has put together a really, really fantastic program on the prosecution and detention behaviors of non-state armed groups or those aspects, those legal issues by non-state armed groups across the globe. We're going to be featuring a pair of really, really talented experts on that call from both the ICRC's Washington, D.C. delegation and from Geneva call. You won't hear from two more knowledgeable folks on this topic. That's on November 3rd, and you can find more information about it. If you reach out to us, we'll give you the link to get registered on it. Back to you, Counselor Hatch.
Just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us, having a little bit of fun in Hawkins today. Again, huge congratulations and thank you to our amazing in-house experts, Lily, Vanita, Thomas, and Miranda. So happy that we were able to share our love with this series with all of you. Hopefully we'll see some of you back on November 2nd or November 3rd for our next event, but we wish you all a happy Halloween and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Happy Halloween, everyone. Take care. Thanks for coming.